This moment of learning, I'm going to tell a story before we go to the first slide. There were a couple young boys. The story about like two 5-year-old boys, and one boy who went to church a lot, and the kid who had just come there, and the one who had just joined there or just come to the church said to the other child, he said, "So, who made that tree?" And the boy says, "Well, God made that tree." He says, "Oh, okay." He says, "Well, who made your house?" And he said, "Well, God made my house." And he says, "Well, who made your parents?" And he said, "Well, God made my parents." And then that question that had to come, "Well, who made God?" And the other kid said, "Well, I guess God made God." Which was a very good answer, even though it's not right, but always going back to God. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today. Just really quick, I'm going to introduce you, hopefully, to a new word. So go ahead and flip to the first thing. We're going to talk about, if God created everything, who created God? I think we know the answer to it, but I bet you we haven't thought too much about what the answer really is. If God created everything, who created God? Can we go to the next slide? The answer is nobody. Nobody created God. Nothing created God. You're like, "Well, of course, I knew that." Well, yeah, but you're way ahead of about a good portion of the world, certainly of academics and other people who try and figure out what created God and are faced with the simple thing of that nothing comes from nothing. So they're like, if we have something, there had to be something, but then what created that something? And they end in this endless loop, and the mystery of how that worked out, they can't understand. But the answer, simple answer, is nobody created God. Well, how do we understand that from a theological perspective? Well, we'll talk about the concept of self-existence. Can we go to the next slide? Self-existence. There's a theological word called aseity or aseity, depending on how you say it. Aseity is basically a theological word which says that God is without creator. He is the creator, that nothing created him. He's self-existent. He doesn't exist by any other power. He exists by his power, his own power alone. He's not derivative. He's not corollary. He's not secondary. He doesn't have a cause. He is the causer. He's not from another source, but he's above and beyond all things. Before there was matter, God was. Thank you. And before there was a clicker, God was. Before there was time, God was. And I think if you plumb the depths of that one, you could really spin your head into a lot of interesting things. That's the fundamental philosophical question that people have asked, whether they be in Christianity or other religions or even just philosophy in general. Where did everything come from? Our answer is simple in one sense, but it's even hard for us to understand the mystery about God. And I think it's important for us to remember that God and his majesty and his glory is beyond our comprehension. Just as we can't understand who even made God, we can't understand how God could know everything. We can't understand all these things, but the fact that we can't understand it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. So I think the wonderful thing about this self-existence is that God himself exists above all things, that everything else is created. When before the beginning of time, before time itself, before matter, there was, the Bible calls, a void. There was nothing. But even then, God was. That's why when Moses says, "Who am I supposed to say?" When the Jews, the slaves, the Hebrews in Egypt, "Who am I supposed to say sent me?" And he says, "Just tell them, I am," because he is. So that's what I have for our moment of learning today.